ahead and prepared 2 pieces of paper like we discussed. They're going to be cut to the same size as your fabric was prepared. So they are both 30 inches long in the lengthwise grain direction by 14 inches wide. And I went ahead and marked center front and center back lines on both pieces. And as you've seen on previous truings, I like to mark that 2 inches in from the edge because that way we'll be able to define a more clear 1 inch of excess, which we'll be doing on these. Both of these patterns, we're just going to be stating that they are on the fold, but the pattern itself will only be for the right half of the body. It's not going to be like the ones we did for the bias where we actually created the entire left to right in our pattern. So actually, after I marked center front and center back, I also did the horizontal balance lines, 12 inches down from the top edge for the front and 7 inches down for the back. And I also went ahead and just pinned my back into place because the back is actually pretty straightforward if you compare it to other transferrings that we've done. I pinned the horizontal balance line and the center back, and this is still with that 1 inch of excess unfolded. I was just sure to match the pencil lines. Then you pin around the corners and you'll simply be transferring all the marks that you see exactly as is. But the front is the one that's a little strange because we have our little dart pinned in place. So I want to show you how to kind of wrestle with this as you do your pinning to transfer the marks. So let's move the back out of the way. Okay. Basically, this process is going to be broken up into 2 halves, okay? So we're going to start by pinning the horizontal balance line first. So I want to be sure that my horizontal balance line and center front marks are matched, and have that be the first pin. And then I'll work my way across horizontal balance line. And you can tell it's going to be tricky because our fabric has all of a sudden become 3-dimensional due to that dart. So do your best to gently smooth it across and match the lines. And as you pin the horizontal balance line, you want to have more pins than we usually do on this area. Normally we can get away with having them every 4 or so inches apart. For this, you should have them closer to every 1 to 2 inches apart. And the reason for that is we're going to be pulling on the fabric a lot above and below this line. So, excuse me, I have a tickle in my throat. Oh, we want to be sure that it's like really secured to the line in a lot of places. So that's why my pins are really close together. And I want to be nudging the line into place. And pinning mine are about 1.5 inches apart. And it's a little tricky because you'll see that when you pin it, the pin will sometimes push the fabric away from where the line should be matched. So really take care to be sure that all your lines stay matched up as you pin. So I got one here, and I'm gonna smooth it over and just I think I gotta do 2 more because I wanna end with a final one just a little bit outside of my side seam marks. Okay, so horizontal balance line is pinned. Now, as we look at this whole upper portion, you can see that it's even going to be kind of tricky to pull your center front line over to match. But what we're basically going to be doing is just focusing on pinning and transferring the marks for the upper half of the pattern before we do anything down below. And that'll kind of give us the freedom to manipulate the fabric up here if we don't have the bottom pinned in place. So I'm going to focus on the top portion first, and I am going to proceed by pinning the center front. So you want to pull your line over to match and also have these pins a little bit closer than usual. I'm going to go maybe every 2 inches or so. And even though I'm kind of pulling over in this direction, I want to be sure that I'm not pulling to stretch out the center front line itself as I pin. So. close there. You can see it's going to start pulling across that dart area a little bit. Okay, one final pin a little bit outside of my neckline markings. All right, so it's definitely looking a little stretched here. And while our goal is usually to not stretch the fabric too much, you're gonna have to stretch it a little for this next part. I wanna be pinning this upper area, and I wanna pull upwards just enough to kind of smooth out these big folds that I see. You're just keeping the dart pinned. So what's gonna help you do this is, rather than just coming to the outer edge to pin, you're gonna put a few pins in the center area, and that's gonna help kind of secure it as we try to flatten it out. So on this lower part, I'm gonna try to smooth upwards, and maybe about here, I'll pin. Okay, see how that's holding this part even? And work my way over and just see how I'm just flattening this area as much as I can. It'll be a little lumpy towards the tip of the dart. Okay, but see, that's already holding that portion for us. So now it's a little easier to move up here and just gently work on opening up that next wide fold. See, I just kind of smooth across without stretching. And place more pins just kind of on this inner area. And right here, I can smooth kind of outward towards the armhole. See how I'm able to flatten that out a little bit. Okay, and now just working further up towards the shoulder seam area, just gently smoothing that fold upwards without stretching. And now I can kind of come up and pin a little bit outside of my actual shoulder seam marks. See, here's this one. Smooth it upwards. And granted, you're still gonna be left with some light little folds, but the idea is to get as close as possible to just sort of flattening it and pretending that this little dart isn't there. And once you have it pinned like this, then you're gonna go and transfer all the marks on the upper portion of the pattern. So I'm gonna come in and get my neckline marked. And shoulder seam, armhole. Okay, and just kind of go right past the dart here. I should have probably put a pin right here to hold my little armhole side seam mark flattened a little bit, but I think as I'm marking it, I can just gently smooth it open to make sure that that hits in the right spot. And then mark the top of the side seam, okay? So once you have this upper part marked, you're going to unpin everything above the horizontal balance line. And that's going to allow the bottom to sit a little more smoothly when you pin it. But the bottom will be a little more straightforward because, oop, I took the wrong one out. I meant to remove that pin. Leave that in the dart. There we go. Okay, so this is now unpinned. And now I can move down to the bottom. And from here, I'll pin the rest of the center front. And we can go back to kind of normal pin spacing, which is, every 5 inches apart, rather than 2 or so. So just work your way down. And then gently smooth outwards to pin any corners. Smooth out and pin outside of the side seam in a couple spots. Then see how this is nice and flat, and we can go in and finish transferring the rest of our marks. So remember that the side seam from the armhole to the waistline, you don't have to trace the whole thing. It's going to be a straight line, but you do have to be sure to follow your dot markings from the waist down to the hip level. That will be trued as a curve. And cross mark at the waist, cross mark at the hip level, and hip level at center front. There we go, okay? So I'm gonna unpin it, sketch in the marks by pencil, just like usual, and then remember doing the back is just straightforward, okay? Once we've transferred all of the marks, we have to do some balancing with our t-shirt. We're gonna be balancing the side seam on the t-shirt, similar to the reasons we had to balance the side seam on the bias slip dress. When we added in our fullness at the hip and waist area, we still may not have done it evenly, and we could end up with an unbalanced side seam, meaning it looks like it's swinging to one direction or the other instead of being straight up and down. So we're going to start by fixing that through the process of balancing. So to balance our side seam, we are going to be looking at 3 individual points and also kind of a portion of the side seam that has a curve in it. The very top of the side seam where it meets the armhole, I'm going to darken those marks. Okay, so side seam at the armhole. This is going to be sort of our constant. This is the point that we're going to match up as we align the papers to do the balancing. And then the actual points that we will be performing the balancing on are the side seam waist. So I'll darken those marks. And the side seam hip, which is also going to be the hem of the finished garment. So I'm darkening all of those. And the side seam between the waist and the hip, just like with the bias slip dress, that portion is going to have a little bit of a curve to its shape. So we have to balance that curve as well. So in addition to darkening those 3 marks, we're going to true the side seam from the waist to the hip level using the hip curve. So this is my back right here, and there should be a very slight curve from the hip to the waist. And I want to follow my marks as best as possible and draw that curved side seam in place. So there's the back, and over here is the front. It's going to look a lot straighter, but it still should have a subtle curve to it when you true it, even if it means coming all the way to the very bottom of your hip curve. And as we draw these in, you could almost kind of visually see how much these need to be balanced. Look at the front side seam, and it is almost looking parallel to the center front. And on the back, it's going, woo, it's swinging way out. So we're going to take them, and through our balancing, it's going to kind of average out. This is going to end up coming out a little bit, and this will come in a little bit until they're sitting at the exact same angle. So we're going to turn the papers together so that we have right sides together, and we want to be matching up the point at the top of the side seam. We're going to use the awl to hold that point in place and adjust the pattern pieces until center front and center back are parallel. That's always our position for our patterns when we're doing the balancing. So again, just like usual, it doesn't matter whether you put the back onto the front or the front onto the back. So I'm just gonna, I have my back on top. I'm gonna match up my marks at the top of the side seam and hold them in place with the awl. Then I want to look over here to my center front and center back and adjust the papers, just rotating from the awl until they are parallel. Not matched up, they will not be matched up, we just want them parallel. So let's see. I'm going to double check if they're parallel by measuring the space between them at the top and bottom. So here I have 3/4. Here I have it's like a 1/16 more than 3/4 at the top. So they're not quite parallel. It means I have to come back and give it a little bit of adjustment. Oh, so tiny. Okay, now I'm gonna check again. Hopefully they are the same measurement now. Yeah, see I'm a hair over 3/4 and same thing down here. Good to go. Okay, so now that these are parallel, we're gonna look over here at our marks that need to be balanced. You're definitely going to see a difference in these. So down here, here's the cross marks for our side seam waist. They don't even look like they're at the same height, do they? We're going to be fixing all that. So I'm going to start by just marking both of these cross marks on the side of the paper that's facing up. And I'm going to take my ruler, and so even though they're sitting kind of diagonal, you hold your ruler in that direction to find the exact measurement or the exact middle between these 2 points, the center of the cross marks. Okay, so mine are 7/8 apart, so I'm gonna come right to the middle and mark 7/16. And right where my pencil is, from there, I'll draw the new cross mark, okay? So that is our balanced side seam waist, ready to go. Now we'll go down and do the same thing at the side seam hip. So I can mark it on this side of the paper. Measure the distance between the cross marks. It's 2 1/8, so half of that is 1 1/16. And then give it legs. Okay. The red doesn't really show up very well over the pencil, but you get the idea. I just want to really highlight the balanced marks. And now after we balance those 2 points, we have to balance the curves of the side seam from the waist to the hip. So I'm just gonna find a few halfway points between these lines and make little dashed marks. And rather than holding my ruler kind of straight like this across to where it's kind of parallel with the grid of the dot paper, see how my waist and hip marks are kind of diagonally cascading? I want to almost hold my ruler at a similar angle as I'm marking all these little midway points. So I can just kind of work my way down, and whenever it hits a number that's easy to divide in half, like here I have a 1 inch difference, you can mark it 1/2 inch. Just work your way down, marking a few halfway points. What's half of 1 3/4? That's 7/8. Okay, there we go. So now I have some little marks. I'm going to use the hip curve to draw my new balanced side seam between the 2 balanced points and trying to kind of follow my little dashed marks. So that looks good. Okay. And it may have missed one of the little marks here, but it got all the rest, so I could have just had a problem with the angle of my ruler there. Just make sure it's a smooth curve. Once you've done all your balancing, now we have to transfer those balanced marks to both pattern pieces. So you're going to use your tracing wheel to roll over all of the marks that were balanced. I can first just trace the entire curve of the side seam from the waist down to the hip, and then just cross mark it at the hip level and the waist level. There we go. Now I can separate the patterns and make my corrections. Okay, so looking over here to my back, I can look for the tracing wheel marks, and it's right here. It's also easier to see on this one because this is the side where it was drawn on the back, so that's exactly what I'm looking at. Here are my balanced marks. Draw the side seam in, and especially when you're truing it on the right side of the paper now, you want to really remember what curve of the ruler you use as you draw the side seam so that you use the same on both the front and the back. So it looks like I have my 20-inch mark at the bottom. I'm going to use that same curve as I come over and do on here. Oh, this paper is so hard to see the little tracing wheel marks unless you put another layer of paper underneath. So that's what I'm going to do. There we came in. Here we came out. Ooh, wow, I thought my eyes were still pretty good, but forgive me, I gotta lean right in the way of this. This is, yeah, it is tough on this paper.
That's probably why they want us to use it.
Right. I bet they've gotten multiple complaints. Okay, so I kind of sketched that in. There's my waist. So I at least know that I can use that same 20-inch mark from the hip. There we go. Okay, so that's my old side seam. I'm going to erase the old one so it doesn't get too confusing. And then same thing over here, erase my old one, which is the outer one. All right, so we've now balanced the side seam. Okay, so that's the whole lower portion of the side seam. Now we can draw the upper portion, which is from the waist up to the bottom of the armhole. And that's just gonna be a straight line. So I'll draw a straight line up on both. Okay, now once we've drawn that side seam in, the lower portion, if we were to match these up, like to true them, we would see that they're the exact same length because of the way we do our truing. But up here, oh, well actually, oh, I forgot we're balancing from the top. These should also be the exact same length in theory, but we need to match them up because that's the only way we're gonna get a smooth armhole curve as it runs past them. So I'm gonna come to either one, and I'm not gonna be able to fold the entire side seam. I just wanna fold the paper under for this upper straight portion. And now I'm gonna be able to bring it over and match it up to the front side seam. Okay, let's see, how am I on length? Yeah, see my waist and armhole marks match, okay? So it's the same length, which is great, but I wanna go ahead and tape them in place just so we can true the bottom of the armhole smoothly. Okay, so I'm gonna just bring in the French curve, and I only need to draw a small portion. Looks like I'm matched up to my marks for quite a bit on either side. Oops, let me lower that a little, like that. Okay, there's the bottom of the armhole, done. Okay. All right, so next, let's go ahead and let's get some of our squaring out of the way. We'll be doing the shoulder in a moment, but I want the neckline to be ready to true for when the shoulder seams are matched. So we're just gonna square the neckline to center front and center back because it's a round curve. So, I'm using a softer pencil today so that it'll show up really dark on this paper, but it means I have to sharpen it like every 2 strokes. All right, so on my back, square the neckline to center back, and on the front, same thing. The front you'll only be able to square a very short portion because it curves up more abruptly. All right, so we're gonna be truing the shoulder seams next, and we have something new and different that's gonna be happening here. This is not gonna be our standard shoulder seam truing. First, I'm just gonna draw the shoulder seams in as a straight line, connecting the cross marks at the neckline and the armhole. So draw in both shoulder seams. Okay, next we're going to match them up. So I'll fold the excess paper under on either one, but you know I always like to pick the back. We're gonna bring them over, and let's just kind of see how we're looking here. If I match up the, oh, not bad, not bad. I'm off by like maybe a 1/16 of an inch at the armhole. So if your shoulder seam is off, as in they're not the same length, then you should choose to match them at the neckline and make the adjustment at the armhole. So I'm gonna tape them in place. So we're about to do a few things here. Okay. So first off, I want to come to the armhole and make my correction. So how do we know which one is right? We're going to use the standard shoulder seam measurement of the dress form. And on these dress forms, I've noticed I actually just went around during lunch and measured a few shoulder seams. It kind of varies. Some of the shoulder seams are 5 1/8 and some are 5 1/4. So some of you have already abandoned your dress forms for the day. I want to say that as you take your measurement, since you may not be able to, directly reference the form you draped on, measure it, and you are going to decide if you're going for a 5 1/8 or 5 1/4 measurement, just depending on which one are you closer to. Okay, let's just make it easy like that. So I'm going to measure mine and see, am I closer to either of those numbers between either mark? Okay, to my one that's shorter, I'm like right on 5. If I go to the longer mark, that means I'm at 5 1/16. So I'm just gonna aim to have the 5 1/8 because it's closer to where I'm already at. So that means I'm gonna first just kind of true the neckline here. So I have a really solid measuring point. Just gonna use the French curve to draw a little bit of the neckline. And from here, I'll measure out along the armhole to get it to be the measurement that I want, which is 5 1/8. Okay, so right here is 5 1/8. I'm just making a tiny mark at the armhole. And now we're going to be truing the neckline and the armhole. Seems straightforward so far, so don't worry, I haven't thrown you the curveball yet, but it is coming, okay? So I've made my length correction for when I true the armhole. I'm gonna do the neckline first. I already have my neckline squared at the center front and center back, so I'm just going to follow my marks as best as I can, have it blend into the squared mark, as well as where it passes the shoulder seam. I didn't like how my lines blended with each other there, so I'm gonna do a little correction. Okay, now the front neckline. Okay, so now we're gonna true the armhole just based on following as many of your marks as possible, but coming to the point you need to for the shoulder seam to be the correct length. So I've already kind of made a little cross mark at that 5 1/8 measurement. I feel like this paper is a little slippery, a little more slippery with the rulers too. Is that just me, or has anyone else noticed that? Okay. It doesn't have the plus signs. That makes it harder to draw a really nice grain line. That I have noticed and don't like.
It does cut easier though.
It does cut easier. I even noticed this week everyone's cutting was better. So. Okay, so here's the front armhole, back armhole. Obviously we know by now it's usually a lot straighter at the top. And then a little curvier at the bottom. Okay, so looking at what we have right now, it's what we've done in previous truings here, right? Our shoulder seams are the same length. We trued the neckline and the armhole. Our curveball is we are about to make the shoulder seams be different lengths than one another on purpose, okay? So we know that on our basic bodice, when we're draping and woven, we created the little shoulder dart on the back, and that's what helps the fabric kind of shape over that upper shoulder blade area. On knits, we don't usually have darts, but sometimes what you'll see is a knit pattern will make the back shoulder seam a little bit longer than the front. And when they're sewn together, that excess is eased into the seam. And that kind of makes a little bit of a three-dimensional curve coming over the shoulder, the same way a dart would be. It looks invisible to the naked eye when you're looking at the garment. You don't see an extra stitch line or an ugly dart. But to sew this, when you're sewing your knits, whether you take the overlock machine route or whether you use your home sewing machine with a zigzag, the way you sew seams like this in knits are you hold the beginning and end points of the two seams to be matched, and you're gonna see that the back one is bigger. You stretch the seam until they look like they're the same length, and you sew over it while the fabric is being stretched out. And when you let go of it, it kind of contracts, and that little kind of excess space is created. So that's what you're gonna be doing when you're sewing the shoulder seam, as well as when you sew your sleeve. There's gonna be a couple things on this garment where when you sew it, one seam is longer than the other. And you're gonna be stretching the shorter one to be the same length as the longer one. And you hold it stretched while you sew it through. So that's what's gonna happen with our shoulder seam. We're gonna be making our back shoulder seam 1/4 inch longer than the front. And you will stretch them to fit while you sew. So I'm gonna come over to the armhole here. This is where we're gonna add our extra. And I wanna measure 1/4 inch further out on the shoulder seam, all right? So I'm gonna start by just making a little mark like that, okay? Here's the armhole. I came out 1/4 on the back and made a mark. Now, I'm gonna untape the shoulder seam, and it was currently matched up at the neckline and the armhole. I'm gonna slide the back down so that at the armhole, my front armhole curve is matched to the new 1/4 inch mark that we made. So I'm giving it a little slide like this. So now you'll see that the necklines are not matched up anymore, but over here, our front armhole is going directly into that 1/4 inch mark. And you're now going to retrue the back armhole, where you want to sort of blend that new mark into the rest of the armhole curve as smoothly as possible. So I could even kind of, ooh, that looks nice, okay? See where I'm holding the French curve now, where it's really coming smoothly and it doesn't blend until way down here, but that's what's gonna make it look nice. If you try to bring this over too high, it'll make this abrupt kind of pointed shape. So I'm gonna hold it just like this and retrue the back armhole from the new mark. There we go. So it's like we just added this little bit over here, and that outer line is the new armhole. Cool. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and separate the shoulder seams. And yeah, we're moving along on this one, okay? Really all we kind of have to focus on as far as the main truing section of the front and back is we gotta look at the hem. And for the hem, we have reason to believe now that our side seams are the exact same length at the mark we have from the hem because we did our balancing. So you are going to draw the hemline by squaring from the center back and center front until you hit the mark at the side seam. It's just gonna be totally straight on the bottom. So I'll bring my L square over here. And granted, you will have a mark that you made when you were draping at the center front and center back hip levels. So your L square may not exactly hit that mark. We kind of just do it sometimes for reference. Sometimes it's just nice to see it there, even if it ends up changing a little bit. So I just want to match my L square to the center back line. And as it comes over, I got to move it a little lower. I want it to hit my cross mark at the bottom of the side seam. Like that. Okay, and now we just draw a straight hemline all the way across, like that. Now we'll do the same thing for the front. And for the front, you may see that the length comes up a little bit, and that's pretty normal. Okay, so I'm squared to the center front, coming over until I come right through my mark at the side seam. There we go. Hemline is done. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and add the seam allowance next, talk about labeling, and then we'll be placing our notches on this pattern. We have something kind of big and new to learn in terms of notching, because for knit patterns, you create an entirely different style of notch. Ooh, okay, so starting off with our seam allowance first though. Let's see. Okay, so knit seam allowances are also different than wovens. What you will typically see is that any major seam on the garment, as in it's not a hem that you're folding up, will get 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Ooh, okay, so where did that number come from? Basically, when knits are sewn on an overlock machine, part of the overlock machine is actually a knife blade that is trimming the edge of the fabric as you sew. And when your seam is finished and you have you'll see that the thread is, looping back and forth, the entire width of that stitch from the edge of the fabric to where the main seam is that holds the garment together, it's going to be 1/4 of an inch wide. So when you're sewing on an overlock, you actually want to be trimming a little bit of the fabric as you go. It's what gives you a cleaner finish. So they usually give knit garments 3/8 of an inch seam allowance because that allows you to trim 1/8 as you're sewing. And then you're left with that remaining 1/4 of an inch wide stitch when you finish. So we're going to be doing 3/8 of an inch seam allowance everywhere on these patterns except for the bottom, where we're going to do our hem allowance at 3/4 instead. So I'm going to start on my side seams, adding 3/8. Okay, so remember that's just 3 squares on your ruler. It's halfway between your 1/4 and 1/2 inch lines. Okay, 3/8 on the armhole. All right, so I'm just working my way all the way up. That is 1/4, that is wrong. It's such a habit for even me to do the to do the 1/4 on the armhole. So 3/8, side seam, armhole, everywhere except the hem. Three-eighths on the shoulder seam. Easy. And 3/8 on the neckline. Okay, there we go. And now I'm just going to add the exact same seam allowances to the back. Okay, so let's see. I'll start on my back neckline, which is also going to get 3/8. Oops. 3/8 on the shoulder seam. Okay, remember your shoulder seam got extended that little bit, so when you come in and add the 3/8 to the armhole, be sure you're adding it to your outer armhole line. Ooh, this curve is always so tight. There we go. There, this is a little ugly. Let's fix you. Okay, side seam, also 3/8. We're almost done, except for the hem. Okay, so there's the main seam allowances. Now we're going to add 3/4 hem allowance to the bottom. Okay, so it's just straight across, 3/4 of an inch. Boom. Do it on the front and the back. Okay, so there we go. We are all allowance-did. So next, we have to add our notches to the pattern, okay? So what I'm gonna do first is I'm gonna indicate the placement of all the notches on these by just using my black pen to draw a little line. But then I'm gonna show you the dimensions of this new crazy notch system that we're gonna use, and we'll go back and add them in all of these spots. So first off, for our side seam, we know that we always wanna notch the top of the side seam in the direction of the side seam. So I'm gonna come right here and see, I'm just kinda indicating a little line at the edge of my seam allowances where we're going to put the actual notch in a minute. So top of the side seam, and then at the bottom of the side seam, we want our notches to be in the direction of the hem allowance. So I'll come down here and sideways. There's my hem allowance notch. Okay. We want to have a notch at the waistline. So right where you have your little waistline mark, just come straight out. That will be a notch on both. Okay. Shoulder seam, we want to have notches at both ends of the shoulder seam in the direction of the actual seam line for the shoulder seam. So I'll mark there and there on both. Okay. Next, we need to notch the center front and center back lines at the neckline. We're going to be saying that these patterns are on the fold. Okay, so right here on the center front, which will be the fold line, I'm going to do a single notch at the neckline for the front. And for the back, this is going to be the double notch that we learned about. And when we're doing a double notch on the fold, our double notches, it should be 2 notches that are exactly 1/2 inch apart, and they should end up centered on whatever your fold line is. So since this is going to be my fold line, I'm going to mark 1 notch 1/4 of an inch away from the center back. Okay, so in theory, if this were going over to the other side after it's folded, imagine our neckline continues and you would end up with the other one also 1/4 of an inch away. Those are the 2 1/2 inch space notches, all right? And last notch placement we're going to add, we need a couple notches along the armhole that are gonna help you when you're sewing the sleeve into this garment. So on the front armhole, we're gonna have a single notch 3 inches up from the bottom of the armhole. And that measurement has to be along the actual seam line of the pattern. So not your seam allowance on this outer corner, but right here, the inner corner, or like your sew line. You're gonna measure from this corner 3 inches up, and that's where we're going to have our notch for the front. So, have we done measuring on curves with the ruler, bent? So whenever you're measuring a curve, you just put your ruler on its edge, and you bend it into shape to follow the exact curve. So if I walk it up, I can see, okay, there's 3 inches on the seam line, but I need to bring it straight out to where it hits the seam allowance, okay? 3 inches up and out. On the back, we're also going to have a 3-inch notch on the armhole, but this one is going to be a double notch. So what that means is the lower of the 2 notches will be at 3 inches, and there will be a second one 1/2 inch above it, okay? So we'll basically be notching at 3 and 3.5 inches up on the armhole. Having the double notch on the back of the armhole is always going to be a clear indicator that that pattern piece is the back. That's what a double notch means. So I'm going to move this up. Okay, so here's my 3 inches right on the seam line. If I moved it out to the seam allowance, it would be right here. So that's the first one at 3 inches. And then measure exactly 1/2 inch up to mark the second one, okay? 1/2 inch space, double notch. Okay, so that's just where the notches are actually going to be on the pattern. But we need to talk about what these new styles of notches are all about, okay? So on knit fabrics, you never want to just do a standard notch where you're making a clip inward on the edge of the fabric, because a lot of knit fabrics can tend to run when you clip inward on them. So instead, on knit patterns, they'll usually make an outward facing notch. Maybe if any of you have done home sewing patterns before, maybe you've seen these before, they look like little triangles and octagons or hexagons sticking out on the edges of the pattern piece. So it's like a little appendage coming out. That's what we're gonna be creating here. So I'm gonna give a very expanded visual of the size and dimensions of each of these notches, okay? So I'm gonna show you for single notch version as well as for double notch version. So let's say, for example, let's say that my paper is not as curly as it is. Okay, so let's say I have, here's the edge of my pattern, okay? There's like the seam allowance. And let's say I know that I wanna have a notch right here, just like we indicated, a little black mark, okay? We're gonna be creating a little triangle that sticks out from the edge of the seam allowance and is centered at the position the notch needs to be at. The width of this triangle at the base of it will be 1/4 of an inch. So that means from the center of where the notch is gonna be, I'm gonna mark 1/8 of an inch outward on either side, okay? So that'll add up to it being 1/4 of an inch in width. It will also be 1/4 of an inch high at the point of the triangle, okay? So again, just saying that this is the center. Let's say I measured out 1/8 to either side, and yes, this is not to scale. That's 1/8 of an inch. This is 1/8 of an inch, okay? So let's see. That makes this whole total distance 1/4 of an inch, okay? Then from the center, come up, or basically out from the edge of your pattern, 1/4 of an inch, okay? So this overall height is 1/4 of an inch, right? You basically need to find those 3 points, and then you connect them to make a triangle. So from the outer mark, I draw to here and back down, okay? So from where the notch is supposed to be centered, it's 1/4 inch wide and 1/4 inch tall, okay? Not too bad, right? So let's say you need to have a double notch on your pattern, because hey, you will. So you're gonna have 2 marks on your pattern that we've already kind of indicated that are going to be 1/2 inch apart from one another. Let's see, can I do this to scale? It's 1/2 inch. Okay, this double notch may not be exactly to scale here, okay? It's gonna end up being a little smaller. So let's say these are separated by a 1/2 inch. At each mark, you're going to mark outward 1/8 and 1/8, so that's your 1/4 inch. 1/4 inch tall, connect. Okay, so you're basically building 2 separate single notches around each of the marks. The other one will look like this, and there will be a space between them. What we also end up doing is, aside from just having these 2 pointy triangle notches, that's a nightmare to cut out of fabric. To use with your scissors and come up around this point and then go down and across that little bit and up and around. So once you have your 2 triangles mapped out, then you're just gonna draw a straight line across the top of the 2 points. So this whole area ends up being the double notch. And when you cut it out of the pattern, you only have to cut around this hexagon shape rather than going in and over and all that, okay? So you're still creating 2 single triangle notches, but then you just connect them across the top and the whole thing becomes the notch that we call the double notch, all right? So that's our expanded version, and I just want to point out too, we are going to be also drafting a sleeve for your t-shirt in a minute. And on Canvas, I have this file printed. It's in the module for this week. It says knit t-shirt sleeve draft. You'll see all the dimensions for the draft that we're about to go over in a little bit, but also up here in the corner, there's a little diagram with all the exact measurements of the notch, the way I showed you over here. So you can always reference this as well for exactly how big to make these notches, okay? So let's go ahead and just apply those to the patterns that we're already working on. Okay, so let's go ahead and just start with a single notch. I know the double ones are a little bit weird. After you see me do a few of these, you'll be like, oh, that's easy, I get it. So, all right. I'm just gonna come down to the bottom of this one to start. So here's my little mark indicating we're gonna have a notch there. From where the mark is right at the edge of the pattern, I'm gonna come out 1/4 of an inch. This is basically going to be the point of the triangle, okay? Then from where the mark is down at the edge of the pattern again, I'm going to mark 1/8 outward on either side of it. Okay, so 1/8 here, 1/8 here. Okay, so I have kind of 3 little dots, and then you just connect them, okay? There's the triangle notch. Now we repeat. Up here on the waist, I can come up 1/4, that's the top of the triangle. Mark 1/8 out to either side, and then connect. Okay. Same thing up here, 1/4 up, 1/8 to both sides, connect the dots, okay? All right, so I'm gonna race through a few more of these. Okay, notch, notch, notch. Okay. Quarter up, 1/8 out on both sides. Okay, one more is gonna happen right here at the center front. This one is on a fold. So what this notch is actually gonna look like when you create it, it's supposed to be centered on this line. So we really only have to draft half of the notch, okay? So right here where the notch is gonna be, you'll measure 1/4 up on that center front fold line, okay? And then I only have to mark 1/8 out on the side that we have the pattern on, okay? So 1/8 out and connect. So this is basically looking like a half of a notch, but when this piece is mirrored on the fold, you end up getting the entire notch centered right on the center front fold line, okay? So that's it for the front. Now I'm gonna jump over to the back because I wanna be able to show you the double notch scenario, okay? And then I'll try to race through some of these last bits and give you a break to work before we do the sleeve. So here on the armhole, here's where we have one of the double notches we need to create. I'm just gonna start by creating 2 of the single notches that we just did a ton of at each of the marks. So here's one mark, come out 1/4 of an inch, or up, out, however you wanna call it, 1/8 to either side of that mark, and then connect. And we do it again at the second mark, the one that's a 1/2 inch above the first. 1/4, 1/8, connect, connect, okay? And once you have those 2 notches, then you're just gonna come to the points at the top, draw it across, and this will be the entire notch. So when you cut the pattern, you go okay? All right, so let's see, I have a couple more single notches. Let me do these as quickly as possible. Now I'm sure you're gonna be experts because you watched me make so many, right? Okay, quarter, 8, connect, up here, quarter, 1/8, almost done, quarter. And you will see that after a while, when you've done a few of them, you don't have to measure. I can do these without measuring, okay? So you will probably get to the point where you can as well. But until you really get a feel for the exact dimensions, then you'll want to use the ruler, okay? Okay, there's that one. And last but not least, here's our other double notch at the center back, okay? So here's the one that I have marked on this side of the center back fold line. I'm gonna create a notch there first. Quarter up, 1/8 to either side, connect, connect, okay? So what's gonna happen is we'll be adding 1 inch of excess paper and folding it to the back, just like we do every other time we're indicating something is on the fold. So let's imagine we've already done that, okay? This is folded under. So as you look at the 1 notch that you already created, 1/4 of an inch from the fold, just come to the tip of the triangle and draw straight across. And then when you're cutting, while that 1 inch excess is folded under, you're gonna cut across the top and down and continue around the pattern, okay? And it'll automatically create the whole double notch for you. Okay, so some finishing details of this pattern. Center front and center back are going to be placed on the fold. So I'm gonna add 1 inch of excess paper beyond the center front and center back lines. Okay. Add the 1 inch, you'll be sure to cut on that line and fold it to the back so that your actual center back line will be the physical fold, okay? Same thing over here on the front. Add 1 inch. And that will be cut and folded under. This is the actual center front line. So let's go ahead and just label the front and back of the pattern. And then while you're working for a bit, I'll cut these out on my own and then we'll regroup and go over the sleeve, all right? So let's draw a grain line on both pieces. Grain lines need to be 1 inch away from center front and center back. And remember, now that we've added that 1 inch of excess, that your center front is the original line that you started this pattern on. So I want to come 1 inch further inward and draw my actual grain line. Okay. And just so it doesn't get confusing, remember you also need to label CF fold and CB fold on the center front and center back lines. So that's going to be this line right here. I'm going to write CF fold, fold here, okay? So that will have an actual fold on that line. Now for the back. 1 inch away from the actual center back line, not that 1 inch extension, you will draw your grain line. And then on the actual center back line, which is this one, right? CB fold for center back fold. Okay, normally a woven garment would have to open somewhere and we couldn't have both front and back on the fold, but it's a knit t-shirt, it's stretchy, you just slip it on, okay? Now for the piece names on the front, you are going to label this front shirt. Size 8, cut 1 because it's on the fold, and your name. And then for the back, you probably know what's coming. It will be titled back shirt. Size 8, cut 1 as well, and your name. Okay, so this is the completed front and back of the shirt. As I said, I'm gonna take a few minutes to get these cut out. I've gone ahead and cut out my front and back shirt pattern. So now you can kind of see how all these little notches look after we've cut around them. So take note of the cutting around the double notch. See, it looks like a little hexagon, as well as here it is on the fold. When you cut across and down, and you unfold it, this notch is the exact same as this one. And over here on the center front, where we also kind of created half of a single notch, that's because when that 1 inch unfolds, you just have a perfect single notch sitting right there on the center front neckline. So these are good to go ahead and set aside. And we're going to be drafting our sleeve now. And this is basically more along the lines of what you'll be doing in pattern drafting classes, because there's no draping required for this. We are drafting this strictly based on measurements, okay? So this sheet of paper that I have, I think it's 12 inches long in the lengthwise grain direction, which you should have placed vertically, and 18 inches wide. You want to start by finding about the middle of the paper, and you want to draw a line that follows the numbered grid. So let me find my center. It's about right here. So on this row of 2s, I want to draw a straight line. This will be my grain line position when the pattern piece is done, and it's also going to be the center of the sleeve. Next, I want to fold my paper exactly on the line. For this particular sleeve, we're actually going to be drafting just half of it, and we'll be cutting it out while it's folded so it will open up and give us the complete sleeve. Granted, this is something you could usually only do with a knit sleeve pattern, because whenever you're creating a more tailored sleeve for sewing with wovens, the front and back of the sleeve are not the exact same shape. You won't get a symmetrical sleeve pattern, but knits are a little more forgiving, so we're going to be able to create a symmetrical sleeve and it'll work out just fine. So we're only going to be drafting from the fold line over. And while it looks like it's kind of for the right, what it's actually going to be is for the front of the armhole. And then what goes off to the other side is the portion of the sleeve that goes around the back. So after you have your fold, come up, roughly about 2 inches from the bottom, and we want to square a line across the paper. Okay, so about 2 inches up. Doesn't have to be a very specific 2 inches. Just square across. And over here, I'll label it. This line is going to be our hem level. Okay, this is without the hem allowance. This is kind of like the finished bottom edge of the sleeve. Next, you're going to measure upwards from the line we just drew 3 inches. We're going to make a mark and square across again. So 3 inches up from the previous line, mark, square across from the fold. And this next line that we're drawing, we're going to label it as the bicep level. Okay, bicep. Okay. Now we're going to come up one more time to make a third line. This is going to be 4.5 inches up from the bicep level line that we just drew. So from here, measure 4.5 upwards on the fold, mark, square it across again, and this final line we will label as the cap of the sleeve, C-A-P, cap. This is the very tippy top of the sleeve, the part that gets matched to the shoulder seam when you sew it, all right? Now, we're gonna come to the line down here for the hem and measure across it 6 1/4 inches. So from the fold, measure along the hem, 6 1/4, and just make a small little mark. Okay, so that's 6 1/4. Then we come to the bicep level, and from the fold, measure along the bicep 6 3/4. Okay, so here's our 6 1/4 on the hem, 6 3/4 on the bicep, and then you're going to draw a straight line to connect those two marks. It's going to look kind of angled. All right. Okay, so this is actually going to be the underseam or underarm seam of the sleeve, and now we're going to work on this whole weird curve that we're going to create. That is the whole armhole portion of the sleeve. So what we want to do is come to this point right here, right where our bicep line meets the fold, and from there, I'm going to take the paper and bring the folded edge down to meet the bicep level. We're basically doing this, and see my fold begins right from here where the fold meets the bicep level, okay? We're doing this to create a 45-degree angle. That's going to be sort of a guideline for this next part. So I want to crease the paper just like that, and unfold it. And I'm just going to lightly draw a line on that fold line. It won't be a final line of the pattern, so I'm just drawing it kind of lightly, but it's just to bring out that guideline that we have. Now, from the bicep up to the cap along the fold here, this is 4.5 inches. What we want to do is almost kind of draw part of a circle that has a radius of 4.5 inches starting from this point. And it's going to sort of curve like this until it hits the 45-degree line that we just drew. So to get this done, use your ruler, and you can have your 4.5-inch measurement matched right to the point there, and just kind of pivot it from there and make a couple small marks. Keep your 4.5 inch right there, and then I'm just kind of rotating the ruler and marking 4.5 inches outward at a few different places until I touch that 45-degree angle guideline. Okay, just like that. Okay, so here's my little series of dashed lines, and now I want to true that curve, just using the French curve ruler. I just want to draw a very smooth curve following all these marks. Okay, and it should really smoothly blend into this line at the cap so that that's almost hitting the fold square. You want to be sure it doesn't come up and create an abrupt point there or anything. It should be nice and rounded. Next, from where that line hits our 45-degree guideline, we want to lightly draw a straight guideline from that point to right here, right where we have this line hitting the bicep level. So connecting these 2 points with a light straight line. There. Now I want to measure the length of the line we just drew and divide it in half to find the exact middle and put a little mark there. So from here to here, mine is, let's see, 4 7/8. So half of that is going to be 2 7/16, which I'll mark right there. From the little mark that you did, we're going to kind of square inward from it, okay? So I'm drawing a little line that's square to the guideline that is 3/8 of an inch. It's like we're bringing this in by 3/8, okay? So see how I can hold my ruler? I have my 3/8 line matched to the guideline, and if I just draw up, here's 3/8 of an inch squared down. Just make a little mark there, okay? Now, for this part, I'm actually gonna sort of freehand my curve first, and then we're gonna use the rulers to true it. So I wanna start at this point and draw this inward curve that comes and meets the little 3/8 mark that we drew right here. That's kind of like the highest part of the curve. And then I wanna curve it back down and have it blend at the end of that section, okay? See, it's like an inward arc, and ultimately that should give you a smooth wave shape for this whole line. And we're now gonna true the whole thing with the French curve. All right, so be sure that at this 3/8 of an inch mark that we drew, that's kind of the deepest part of this curve, okay? You don't want your curve to come in lower at any point other than right there in the middle of the line. So it can kind of come in either side with my French curve. And as it comes up here, I don't want this to be a point. So kind of bring it around and round it off so that you just get a really smooth wave shape. Okay, is that smooth enough for me? I don't know. I think I'm gonna smooth that out a little more. Okay. All right. So this is now the entire sort of sleeve cap or armhole shape of our sleeve pattern. And now we're just ready to go ahead and add our seam allowance and our notches. So first things first, we're going to add 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to this side right here, which is the underarm seam, and also continue that 3/8 following our wavy sleeve cap shape. Okay, so 3/8 just until I hit the hemline. And then I want to follow this whole curve, adding 3/8. Coming from this direction, it's a little easier. Okay, so there's my 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And now we're gonna come to the hem and add 3/4 of an inch straight across the bottom. So below the hemline that we have, that's the finished hem. This is our 3/4 hem allowance. And I'm gonna draw it kind of long because what's gonna happen right here is we're gonna just have a little preview of some of the techniques that you'll probably learn more of in pattern 1, which is shaping the corners of your seam allowance. This is something we haven't talked about yet. So far, whenever we've added seam allowance, we just kind of follow the direction of each side until they sort of meet. And maybe you've even noticed that sometimes when you're sewing, if you match the corners of your fabric to sew a seam, then when you actually sew the seam, the upper edges of the fabric don't match, okay? So there is a solution to that, and it does involve certain methods of shaping the corners. But what I want to talk about more is how to shape the hem allowance at the bottom here. If we just let the edge of the seam allowance continue in this direction until it hits, then when you go to fold this hem upwards, see how the sleeve gets smaller as it goes downward, right? It tapers inward. If we were to fold that up, then this bottom edge of the hem allowance, when it folds up inside the pattern, it would be hitting up here, and at the inside, it would actually angle inward, and it would start to feel like the sleeve is really tight on the inside where the hem is. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna build a little shape into the bottom of the hem allowance where it actually flares out, so that when you fold it up, the hem allowance fills the whole space of the sleeve and kind of mirrors that shape. And this is something that you'll wanna do on the hems of pretty much anything that comes downward and tapers. So the bottom of pants, the bottom of sleeves, all right? So I'm gonna erase that little sketchy portion I have. Here's my hem allowance already drawn across. I'm gonna fold my paper exactly on the hem line, the one that we labeled hem at the beginning, not the 3/4 inch addition, okay? So I'm just gonna fold it under. This is as if I'm actually folding the hem at the bottom to sew it. Okay. So now we look, it's folded under. And then you're gonna take your tracing wheel and come over here to the underarm seam. You're gonna trace the, basically the outer line, your seam allowance line, just for a small portion of it, like that. And then when you unfold it, you're gonna see, well, in theory, I know this paper, it's a little tricky, there it is. Here's the line that was left by the tracing wheel. See, it angles outward after the fold line. And I'm just gonna come and pencil that in, and that's gonna be the shape of the bottom edge of the sleeve now, so that when it folds up, this corner will come all the way out to here rather than angling further inward on the inside. Okay, so that's all of our seam and hem allowance. Now we just have to add our notches, our new favorite awesome notches, okay? So, first off, on the underarm seam, we're gonna have one notch at the top of it. It's gonna be directly in line with the seam line right here. So I could even come to that seam line, not the seam allowance, but the sew line. I can even just kind of extend it straight up and build my notch around that point. So I'll mark 1/4 inch up in the middle, 1/8 outward on either side, and then connect the dots. There's my little triangle notch. And we also know that at the bottom of a seam like that, imagine that this is like a side seam, we usually want to have our notch in the direction of the hem allowance instead. So right here, right where we just folded the paper, you're going to add a notch to indicate the fold line of the hem. So come up 1/4, out 1/8 on either side, and connect. And now we're gonna have a really weird situation with these next notches, and just kind of bear with me until we cut it out, and I can probably explain it better once we get like 2 steps down the line. But on a sleeve, we just talked about the fact that we're making a symmetrical sleeve shape, okay? The pattern is gonna be the same on both sides. And basically this portion is the front half of the sleeve. The part that will be over here is the back. On the armhole of the sleeve, we need to have notches that will match up to the ones that we put on the armholes of our shirt pattern, okay? So remember on these, on the front, we have a notch, a single notch, 3 inches up on the front armhole, and a double notch, 3 inches up on the back armhole. We're gonna put notches at the same spot on this sleeve, but how do we end up with different notches when we're cutting our pattern while it's mirrored, okay? I'm gonna show you, it's gonna seem weird at first, but it'll come together in the end. So, on your pattern, as you see it, you want to come to this point right here. This is the seam line of the underarm seam meeting the armhole. And you want to measure along this curve 3 inches. And we're going to create a notch here. Okay, so I measure 3 inches up. Okay, if I mark it on the seam line, it's right there, but I want to bring it straight out to the actual seam allowance line. And we're going to draw a notch there. Okay, so it was 3 inches up. So right now it's a single notch. We're gonna turn it into a double notch, okay? So from that first notch, right where we made our initial mark, our 3 inch mark, measure up 1/2 inch and make another little mark to build the second notch around, okay? So 1/2 inch, and here's gonna be the location of the next notch that will turn it into a double. So mark here. Okay, so there's the 2 notches. Their centers are a 1/2 inch apart. We want it to be a double notch. So I'm just gonna draw a straight line across the tops to connect them. Okay, so what's gonna happen is we're gonna cut this pattern and we're gonna cut around the double notch, but then once it's opened up, we're gonna come to the side that's supposed to be our front and cut away the upper notch so that we're only left with the single one on the half that needs a single. And then the side that actually needs the double is the other one. We're gonna leave that be, okay? So that's gonna happen there. And additionally, we need one more notch to create here. It's gonna be at the top of the sleeve cap, but it's not gonna be exactly on the fold. It needs to be a little further to the front end of the sleeve. From the fold, you're going to measure 1/4 of an inch over, You could just mark it kind of right on the seam allowance, okay? And we're gonna create a single notch right at this spot, 1/4 from the fold. So up 1/4, out 1/8 on each side, connect, connect, okay? So this notch, we're gonna cut it out while the pattern is folded. That's gonna give us the same notch placed on this side as well. But when we're done, we're gonna cut that one away. We only need to keep the one that is on this side that we just drew, okay? I'm gonna walk you through it when we get there, but once you have these notches drawn, now we're gonna cut the sleeve pattern. And just a tip on the cutting, as I've observed some of your homework stuff now, and we've cut quite a few patterns lately where we've had to mirror them on a fold while cutting. If you had the comment on yours that in your cutting section, the left and right sides were not accurately mirrored when you cut, that means the 2 layers of the paper shifted a little bit. And as we look at it folded, the edges do not match up. It means your left and right sides are not totally identical. So what'll help with that, as we're moving forward and cutting the sleeve, is staple around the edge of the paper a little bit before you cut, and that'll keep things from shifting too much, okay? I'm gonna cut that away just so I can get in with more staples. Okay. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and cut, and I'm gonna cut around all the notches that we've created, but then I'll tell you what to do with them after to turn this into a finished pattern. Okay, so I'm cutting all the way around this double notch right here. Cut all the way around that single one that we did, a little ways from the fold. There we go. Okay, so I've cut it out. When we open it up, of course, it's going to be the same on both sides. And just a reminder, be sure when you draft this pattern that you draft it in the same direction I did, where you start at the fold and you're drafting over to your right, okay? So now that we're done, we're gonna open it up and leave it unfolded. And now we wanna come to this side of the sleeve. We wanna come to that double notch that we just drafted, and we want to cut away the upper notch and that space between, so that all that remains is the lower single notch, the original one that's 3 inches up from the seam line, okay? The double notch on the other side will stay. This is the one we want to be a double. So you should be able to see all your lines to cut across the bottom, and then down here, okay? So now we're left with the single notch, because as you look at a sleeve pattern, when you go to sew it, you're always gonna look for the side with the single notch and know that's the front of the armhole. The double notch means that's the back of the armhole. And next, come up here to where we now have 2 notches up at the sleeve cap. The one that we drew on the side that we drafted in pencil, that's the one that stays. Go to the other notch on the left side, cut it off, okay? So just kind of follow the edge of the seam allowance and smoothly cut it away. There we go. We ultimately just want to be left with a single notch up here, but it's not supposed to be exactly on the center. It's a little ways to the front. And this is because when you go to sew this sleeve, that notch gets matched up to the shoulder seam, and it shouldn't be exactly centered because the front of the armhole measurement is always a little bit smaller than the back. So we need to have a bigger distance to get to that notch that goes at the shoulder seam. All right, labeling our pattern. First, we need a grain line, and your grain line is going to be drawn exactly in the center of the sleeve, right on the fold line where we started the pattern. Okay, and then for your piece information, you can title it just sleeve, size 8, cut 2, because of course we need a left and a right, and your name, okay? There we go. So your completed pattern will include those 3 pieces, sleeve, plus the front and back shirt. For rabbit punching, punch in the lower end in the center of the bottom of both of these pieces. And for your sleeve, I would say punch it more on this side, the left side of the sleeve where we didn't draft on, right about here, so that it hangs like this, okay? You'll put those all in a pattern hook, and that's your pattern submission. Now, you're gonna be cutting and sewing this garment, okay? And a tip on cutting it, for your front and your back, these both need to be on the fold of your fabric, right? And we know that that fold also needs to run parallel to the selvages. If you take your entire piece of knit fabric and fold it over to bring both selvages together, you'll get one fold over here. And so let's say you cut the front on the fold. The area next to it is not on the fold, so you can't cut the back. You're then gonna be forced to just put the back below the front on another part of the fold. And what's gonna happen is you're gonna waste so much fabric. When you open it up, you're just gonna have a big hole missing in the middle. So the best way to cut this, I have a little diagram posted. I'm not sure if I'm pointing these out to you. On Canvas, when you look at the links that I call homework links, they have the examples of, photo examples of everything. And the one that's for the actual sewn sample, it'll show you how to lay out your fabric to cut it. And the best way to cut two pieces that are on the fold is to take your knit fabric and bring both selvages in to the center of the fabric. You will end up with a fold on both sides, and you can put one piece on this fold, one piece on this fold, and then you're not taking a big chunk out of the middle of the fabric. The sleeve is just a cut too that's not on the fold, so you will just need to find another separate small section to double the fabric and cut two of the sleeves. And then for sewing, you're going to look, as I mentioned, there's two separate sets of instructions. So when you go to week 8 for knit t-shirt, you'll see two separate sewing instruction files. One says for home sewing machine with zigzag, the other says for overlock and cover stitch machines. And the one for the home sewing machine with zigzag, that one is gonna look similar to the ones you've seen so far, where just to note that you're gonna be seeing it on the half scale garment. It'll look like a tiny little t-shirt, but all the steps are gonna be exactly the same, and it will specify the length and width to set your sewing machine to for the zigzag. So all sewing machines, even the most basic ones, will have a stitch length and stitch width when you're on the zigzag. And be sure you check at the beginning of that file for the proportions to set your machine to, okay? And so things that are different about that, when you're sewing with the zigzag stitch, a lot of your seams get pressed open. If you choose to sew it with the overlock and cover stitch machines, your seam allowances are sewn together, so you can only push into one side or the other. And the one that is meant, the instructions that are meant for the overlock, it'll tell you which direction to press. It'll tell you which part of the garment to sew using the overlock versus the cover stitch, because they are two separate machines for those different stitches. And that one is actually shown on a full scale garment when you look at the one for overlock and cover stitch. It's a little bit older, made a couple of years ago. If you're sewing knit fabrics on your home sewing machine, it's usually best that you get a different type of needle for your machine. I know that in industry sewing, when I taught it, I overviewed different needle sizes in relation to the weight of the fabric. So as you use a heavier and heavier fabric, you need to use a slightly larger needle, right? But I didn't really talk about needle types. There's different types of needles for different types of fabrics. And usually the type of needle that you use for sewing woven fabrics like muslin is called a Sharps needle. But for sewing knits, to get better performance and to not have your machine be jamming a lot, you'll want to look for a type of needle called a ballpoint needle, okay? Ballpoint needles are meant for knit fabrics. And they will just kind of slide through the knit fabric much better rather than snagging it or getting stuck along the way. So that can be a big game changer if you're choosing to sew this at home, is having that type of needle. And just some additional suggestions that will also help you out. Has anyone heard of a walking foot for your sewing machine? Or have one, know what they are, I see some nods. The walking foot will also help you out a lot in sewing knits, and I want to kind of talk about why. The overlock machines, they have a different kind of feed mechanism underneath that pulls the fabric through. So you know when you look at the sewing machine underneath the presser foot, there's the little teeth. They're called the feed dogs, literally F-E-E-D, dogs, as in woof woof dogs. And those are what pull the fabric through, okay? Now, on a standard straight stitch machine, there's just one set of feed dogs, and they're just kind of pulling it like this. But on an overlock machine, which is mostly made for sewing knit fabrics, you'll see there's two sets of feed dogs in front and behind each other, and they kind of juggle the fabric through at different rates. So that's why the fabric just flows through really nicely. And that's why if you've ever already tried sewing knit fabrics at home, maybe you've seen that the fabric kind of stretches a lot or it goes off track, or okay? That's because those types of feeds aren't really designed for knit fabrics. But if you have a walking foot, it will help you out a lot. And that's because the walking foot, it helps pull the fabric through from the top in addition to the bottom. So if you've opened, sometimes they are sold separate from your machines, sometimes they come with them. You'll know it because it's not a little presser foot in with the other ones, it's usually in a big separate box. It looks like this crazy robot contraption. But if you know you have one, use it when you're sewing the knit fabrics. It will help out a lot, okay?